We all know St. Thomas Aquinas as a champion of scholastic theology, philosophy, and his great intelligence which dominated and influenced Europe for centuries and the world to come. He put together faith and reason, masterfully weaving together Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic doctrine. He has given us insight on topics stretching from metaphysics, epistemology, moral philosophy, sacramentology, politics, and so forth. We are influenced by him from the 5 ways down to our no meat on Fridays rule. You probably want to know more about his theology and his philosophy, but this video is intended to show the side of St. Thomas Aquinas that many people never see him for. I wanted to make this video in honor of him as my patron saint, and because he has interceded for me many times in the past, and I pray to him like a reverend friend often, and so should you. It is a shame many people don't know about the life of St. Thomas and who he was, but this video will give you a run-through of his life and work. It was 1225, born of Theodora Galluccio and Landulf VI of Aquino. St. Thomas Aquinas was born in modern-day Roccasecca, Italy, a town between the cities of Naples and Rome. Shortly before he was born, a Benedictine monk had prophesied to Theodora of St. Thomas that one day he would enter the order of Friars Preacher, much more known as the Dominican order, and he would have an unmatched sanctity and would be of great learning. Shortly after he was born, St. Thomas found a slip of paper on the ground, and he refused to let go of it. The paper slip had the words inscribed onto it, Ave Maria, gratia plena. In other words, Hail Mary, full of grace. His mother, upon seeing these words, returned the paper to the infant Thomas, and he swallowed the paper, which is a future reference to his great devotion to Our Lady. He was the youngest of 6 children, consisting of 3 brothers and 2 sisters. St. Thomas Aquinas was intended to pursue the abbacy to succeed his uncle, who at the time was the current abbot of Monte Cassino, the oldest Benedictine monastery. This is where St. Thomas began his studies as early as the age of 5. Unfortunately, in 1239, the abbey was split after a conflict between Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX, so his parents pulled him out and relocated him to another university that was established by Frederick II. This is where he was taught the quadrivium, grammar, and classical logic by Petrus de Ibernia and Martin of Dacia. It was also at this university that St. Thomas was exposed to Aristotle, Averroes, Maimonides, and Avicenna, who would later influence his theology. Soon enough, St. Thomas would come under the influence of the Dominican recruiter John of St. Julian. It was at the age of 19 that St. Thomas had firmly resolved to join the Dominican order. This did not please his worldly family, who wanted to make him to a wealthy Benedictine abbot, contrary to the Dominican ideal of poverty. The Dominicans have heard of possible interference from Theodora in response to St. Thomas's choice, so they had arranged to move St. Thomas from Naples to Rome and from Rome to Paris. Unfortunately, St. Thomas was caught drinking from a spring by his brothers while he was journeying to Rome, and they took him back forcibly to the castle of Monte San Giovanni Campano, where he was imprisoned for 1 year in order to prevent him from assuming the Dominican habit, and as well as to force him to renounce his new goals. St. Thomas spent his time praying and studying in his tower, and he still resolved to join the Dominicans. He even tutored his sisters and was in contact with the Dominican order. The Pope could not intervene and order for St. Thomas's release due to political reasons that were preventing him from doing so. St. Thomas was not moved, however. Seeing this, his brothers attempted to sway him of his vocation by sending in his tower a whore to seduce him to commit sins against chastity, so he might be dissuaded of a celibate vocation. To the later surprise of the Aquino family, St. Thomas took a hold of a burning log and chased the whore around his room until she screamed loudly, begging to be let out. After this, he inscribed a cross on the wall, and he fell into a trance, where 2 angels appeared to him and told him, "Behold, we gird you by the command of God with the girdle of chastity, which henceforth will never be imperiled. What human strength cannot obtain is now bestowed upon thee as a celestial gift." Unquote. Nobody ever knew he had this mystical experience, save only his confessor. After this, he never experienced any movements of the flesh ever again. He wore this girdle until he died, never taking it off. The girdle was given to the ancient monastery of Vercelli in Piedmont and is now at Chieri, near Turin, Italy. It was this event that sealed the deal for the Aquino family. They realized St. Thomas would never change his mind, and they were powerless to do so. So in order to save the Aquino family's dignity from embarrassment, Theodora arranged for St. Thomas's window to be left unlocked, and to have him escape through there in order to make it look like a secret escape was less embarrassing than an open surrender to the Dominicans. After St. Thomas escaped in the night, he went to Naples and then Rome, where he met the Master General of the Dominican Order. In 1245, St. Thomas was sent to the University of Paris, where he studied under the great German scholastic and Dominican St. Albertus Magnus of Cologne, who held the chair of theology at St. James's College in Paris. After St. Albertus Magnus was sent to teach at a new university in Cologne, Pope Innocent VI offered St. Thomas the Monte Cassino Abbacy as a Dominican, which St. Thomas humbly declined in order to follow his great teacher. St. Albertus declared St. Thomas to Magister Studentium, which was then a prestigious position since St. Thomas was quiet and did not talk very much, which would garner the attention of his fellow students, who thought he was slow and gave him the name the Dumb Ox of Sicily, until St. Albert prophetically exclaimed to them, "You call him the Dumb Ox, but in his teaching he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world," prophesying the worldwide influence of Thomism and his future legacy that he would come to leave behind. St. Thomas then taught in Cologne, where he taught Old Testament books to students and was writing his literal commentary on Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Lamentations. In 1252, he returned to Paris with the intention of earning a master's degree in theology. He also lectured on the Bible as an apprentice professor and then became a bachelor of the sentences. He devoted his final 3 years of studying to writing his commentary on Peter Lombard's The Sentences, which would be his hallmark work before the Summa Theologiae, and then he wrote On Being and Essence for his fellow Dominicans residing in Paris. This would be the first overview of Thomistic metaphysics as we know it. So in about early 1256, Mendicant orders had come under polemical attacks from William of St. Amour, which got St. Thomas to write a treatise titled Against Those Who Assail the Worship of God and Religion. Between this time and 1259, St. Thomas befriended our also beloved saint and doctor, St. Bonaventure of Bagno Reggio, and taught alongside each other. These two holy saints were also the personal advisors of King Louis IX, and allegedly also met the future Pope Clement IV. St. Thomas produced many more works, such as Disputed Questions on Truth, Quodlibral Questions, and both commentaries on Boethius' On the Trinity and De Hebdomadibus, which were commentaries on the works of the 6th century Roman philosopher St. Boethius. After this, St. Thomas started working on the Summa contra Gentiles, which he initially wrote the first 53 chapters in Paris, mainly against the religion of Islam, which he called the easiest religion to defeat, because back then, Islam, not being so corrupted and altered like its modern-day counterpart, was so obviously wrong and very refutable. He made the Summa contra Gentiles in 1259 by the alleged request of Raymond de la Peñafort for a book that would help the Dominican missionaries in Al-Andalus, located in modern-day Spain and Portugal, to convert the Muslims and Jews there, because Raymond was an active apologist against the Moorish and the Marranos. In 1259, St. Thomas completed his first regency and left Paris so that others in his order could gain this teaching experience. He journeyed back to Naples, where he was appointed as general preacher by the provincial chapter on the 29th of September, 1260. A year later, he was called to Orvieto, where he served as a conventual lector, where he was responsible for the pastoral formation of the friars who couldn't attend a studium generale. Here in Orvieto, St. Thomas completed the Summa contra Gentiles and wrote the infamous Catena Aurea, and wrote the liturgy for the newly added Corpus Christi at the request of Pope Urban IV. He was matched against his friend, St. Bonaventure, to write the liturgies for Corpus Christi. When St. Thomas began to read his manuscript at the presentation, the Holy Father and St. Bonaventure were weeping tears of emotion in response to the beauty and the eloquence contained in St. Thomas's missal. As St. Thomas continued to read aloud his manuscript, St. Bonaventure turned to the side and ripped his own manuscript that he prepared, and when his turn came, St. Bonaventure announced his manuscript useless and praised that of St. Thomas's, and while we will never know what St. Bonaventure wrote, he, along with St. Thomas, were still pleasing to God in their earthly lives, and they both forever praise him evermore together in heaven. His most notable contributions in Corpus Christi are the hymns of Pange Lingua and Panis Angelicus. He also wrote against the Greeks. St. Thomas was called to Rome in 1265 by Pope Clement IV to serve as the papal theologian, which would then start the Dominican tradition, where Dominicans are usually called to serve as papal theologians in the Vatican. This same year, he was ordered by the Dominican chapter of Agnani to teach at the Studium Conventuale at the Roman convent of Santa Sabina, founded in 1222. The Studium at Santa Sabina now became an experiment for the Dominicans, which was the order's first Studium Provinciale, an intermediate school between the Studium Conventuale and the Studium Generale. Prior to this time, the Roman province had offered no specialized education of any sort, only with their basic courses in theology for resident friars, which were functioning in Tuscany and the Meridionale during the first several decades of the order's life. The new Studium Provinciale at Santa Sabina was to be a more advanced school for the province. An associate and early biographer of Thomas, named Tolomeo da Luca, tells us that the Santa Sabina Studium that Thomas taught at had the full range of philosophical subjects, both moral and natural. Here is where St. Thomas began his opus magnus, the Summa Theologiae, which he would write exclusively for clergy in early theological formation. He allegedly said, because a doctor of the Catholic truth ought not to teach only the proficient, but to him pertains also to instruct beginners, as the Apostle says in 1 Corinthians 3 verses 1 through 2, as to infants in Christ, I gave you milk to drink, not meat. Our proposed intention in this work is to convey those things that pertain to the Christian religion in a way that is fitting to the instruction of beginners. While there he wrote a variety of other works, like his unfinished Compendium Theologiae and his reply to Brother John of Vercelli regarding 108 articles drawn from the work of Peter of Tarentaise. In his position as head of the Studium, Thomas conducted a series of important disputations on the power of God, which he compiled into his work De Potentia. Nicholas Brunacci was among St. Thomas's students at the Santa Sabina Studium Provinciale and later at the Paris Studium Generale. In November 1268, he was with Thomas and his associate and secretary Reginald of Piperno. As they left Viterbo on their way to Paris to begin the academic year, another student of St. Thomas's at the Santa Sabina Studium Provinciale was Blessed Tomaseo de Perugia. In 1268, the Dominican order assigned St. Thomas to be the regent master of the University of Paris for a second time, a position he held until early 1272. A part of the reason for this sudden reassignment appears to have arisen from the rise of Averroism, or radical Aristotelianism, in the universities. Not only was this academic trend controversial, but many thought that St. Thomas himself might be following Averroes, since St. Thomas also drew on Aristotle extensively, and in response to distinguish his positions from these perceived errors, St. Thomas wrote two more works, one of them being De Unitate Intellectus contra Averroistas, namely on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists, which he reprimands Averroism as incompatible with Christian doctrine.
These works can be found in his opuscular works located at Aquinas CC. Also, during his second regency, he finished the second part of the Summa and wrote De Virtutibus, on the virtues, and De Aeternitate Munda contra Murmanantes, on the eternity of the world against grumblers, the latter of which dealt with controversial Averroist and Aristotelian beginninglessness of the world. Disputes with some important Franciscans conspired to make this second regency much more difficult and troubled than the first. A year before St. Thomas reassumed the regency at the 1266 and 1267 Paris disputations, the Franciscan master, William Baglione, accused Thomas of encouraging Averroists and most likely counting him as one of the blind leaders of the blind. St. Thomas was deeply disturbed by the spread of Averroism and was angered when he rediscovered Siger of Brabant teaching Averroistic interpretations of Aristotle to Parisian students. On December 10, 1270, the Bishop of Paris issued an edict condemning 13 Aristotelian and Averroistic interpretations and positions as heretical and excommunicating anyone who continued to support them. Many in the ecclesiastical community, the so-called Augustinians, were fearful that this introduction of Aristotelianism and the more extreme Averroism might somehow contaminate the purity of the Christian faith. In what appears to be an attempt to counteract the growing fear of Aristotelian thought, Thomas conducted a series of disputations between 1270 and 1272, De Virtutibus in Communi, on virtues in general, De Virtutibus Cardinalibus, on cardinal virtues, and De Spe, on hope. In 1272, Thomas took a leave from the University of Paris when the Dominicans from his home province called upon him to establish a studium generale wherever he liked and staff it as he pleased. He chose to establish the institution in Naples and moved there to take his post as a regent master. He took his time at Naples to work on the third part of the Summa while giving lectures on various religious topics. He also preached to the people of Naples every day in Lent of 1273. These sermons on the Ten Commandments, the Creed, and Our Father and the Hail Mary were very popular. St. Thomas has been traditionally ascribed with the ability to levitate and as having had various mystical experiences. For example, G.K. Chesterton wrote that his experiences included well-attested cases of levitation and ecstasy, and the Blessed Virgin Mary appearing to him to comfort him with the welcome news that he would never be a bishop, in response to St. Thomas declining the offer given to him to the Episcopaliate of Naples. It is traditionally held that on the one occasion, in 1273, at the Dominican convent of Naples, in the chapel of St. Nicholas, after Matins, St. Thomas lingered and was seen by the sacristan, Dominic of Caserta, to be levitating in prayer with tears before an icon of the crucified Christ, where Christ said to St. Thomas, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What reward would you have for your labor?" To which St. Thomas responded famously, "Non nisi te Domine," nothing but you, Lord. On December 6, 1273, another mystical experience took place. While St. Thomas was celebrating Mass, he experienced an unusually long ecstasy. Because of what he saw, he abandoned his routine and refused to dictate to his Socius Reginald of Piperno. And when Reginald begged him to get back to work, St. Thomas replied famously, "Reginald, I cannot, for all I have written seems like straw to me." Unquote. And he allegedly threw one of his books into a fireplace because of how worthless it was next to God. Reginald was desperate, so he grabbed the book and tanted out the flames. As a result, the Summa Theologica would forever remain uncompleted. What exactly triggered St. Thomas's change in behavior is believed to have been a kind of supernatural experience from God, some even proposing that he had experienced the briefest seconds, the briefest experience of the beatific vision. After taking to his bed, he did recover some strength. In 1274, Pope Gregory X summoned St. Thomas to attend the Second Council of Lyon. The council was to open on May 1st, 1274, and it was Gregory's attempt to try to heal the great schism of 1054, which had divided the Catholic Church between East and West, resulting in the birth of the Eastern Orthodox Church. At the meeting, Thomas's work for Pope Urban IV concerning the Greeks Contra Errores Graecorum was to be presented. However, on his way to the council, riding on a donkey along the Appian Way, he struck his head violently on the branch of a fallen tree and became so seriously ill again. When he was quickly escorted to Monte Cassino to convalesce, after resting for a while, he set out again, but stopped at the Cistercian Fossanova Abbey after falling again ill. The monks nursed him for several days, and as he received the last rites, he was praying, "I have written and taught much about this very holy body, and about the other sacraments in the faith of Christ, and about the Holy Roman Church, to whose correction I expose and submit everything I have written." Unquote. Finally, on the 7th of March, 1274, surrounded by weeping Cistercian monks, St. Thomas finally succumbed to his illness and passed away while giving commentary on the Song of Songs. Unfortunately, the Parisian bishop who condemned Averroism also condemned St. Thomas's theology because he saw it as too rigid and using too much reason to jail God's omnipotence. By the 1300s, however, St. Thomas's theology had begun its rise to prestige, especially when Dante Alighieri had written about the glorified soul of St. Thomas in the Heaven of the Wise next to his friends St. Albertus Magnus and St. Bonaventure together with him in paradise. Other instances that helped his canonization was the discovery of his incorrupt body months after he died. When St. Thomas's body was exhumed to transfer to another tomb, his body was found to be incorrupt, like that of a sleeping man, and his body was exuding a sweet perfume-like smell. Another time during a sea voyage, the ship carrying messengers to Pope John XXII was caught in a severe storm and driven toward a reef, and the messengers cried out to St. Thomas for his intercession. And in response, a new wind arose, saving the vessel from destruction. When the devil's advocates at his canonization process objected that there were no miracles, one of the cardinals answered, "Tot miraculis quod articulis." There are as many miracles in his life as articles in his Summa. 50 years after Thomas's death, on the 18th of July, 1323, Pope John XXII, seated in Avignon, pronounced Thomas as a saint. A monastery at Naples, Italy, near the Naples Cathedral, shows a cell in which he supposedly lived. His remains were transferred from Fossanova to the Church of the Jacobins in Toulouse, France. And on the 28th of January, 1369, between 1789 and 1974, they were held in the Basilica of Saint Sernin in order to protect them from the ongoing French Revolution, which unfortunately had disrespected the body of Saint Bonaventure. In 1974, they were returned to the Church of the Jacobins, where they were to have been remained ever since. The Catholic Church honors St. Thomas as a saint in heaven and regards him as a model teacher for those studying for the priesthood. In modern times, under papal directives, the study of his works was long used as a core of the required program of study for those seeking ordination as priests or deacons, as well as for those in religious formation and for other students of the sacred disciplines, meaning philosophy, Catholic theology, church history, liturgy, and canon law.
His feast day is traditionally on March 7th. Pope Pius V proclaimed St. Thomas Aquinas as the fifth doctor of the Church on the 15th of April, 1567, with the papal bull Mirabilis Deus, and ranked his feast with those of the four great Latin fathers, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Jerome, and St. Pope Gregory the Great. At the Council of Trent, St. Thomas had the honor of having his Summa Theologiae placed on the altar alongside the Bible and the Decretals. This was in response to a revival in scholasticism during Baroque times. Second Scholasticism gave an emphasis to the works of Thomas and John Duns Scotus, with more Franciscans following Duns Scotus and Dominicans and Carmelites following St. Thomas. Thomists, or those following St. Thomas, included Francisco de Vitoria,
Thomas Cajetan, Franciscus Ferraniensis, Domingo de Soto, Domingo Bañez, Joao Poinsot, and Complutenses and others. St. Thomas continues to remain influential today among younger audiences and clerics. It is unfortunate that the modernists at Vatican II sect employ his Summa Theologiae and as an excuse to spread their poisonous modernist doctrines. St. Thomas, when read correctly, is the antidote to modernism. I would argue that hatred of St. Thomas and his thoughts is a sign of reprobation. Let us pray for the intercession of St. Thomas in our lives and for those who aspire to become well-formed academic priests and scholars.